Good morning, everyone. That was easier than last year. Good morning, everyone. I'm Linda Ovens. I'm the chair of the CWM Scotland Centre, and I'm here to welcome you, along with Mr Ian Gulland of Zero Waste Scotland, to our event, our Scottish Resources Conference for 2014. Great to be doing this again and to see everyone turn out in a very rainy Glasgow. I'm not going to say too much today. You'll hear from me later on. But I have to do the housekeeping as normal. So emergency procedures, if you hear the message, an emergency situation has arisen, I'm sure it's probably in a man's voice, isn't it? Please leave the building by the nearest available exit. And then it will be interdispersed with a two-tone siren. Evacuate the building via the nearest available exits. That'll be there. And head that way, I presume, on the way out. Mobile phones, please switch them off or put them on flight mode, is what I've just been told, so they don't go dit-dit-dit, even if they're on silent. I expect a few of you to do it. Somebody must be checking their phone at this point. Presentations will be available online after the event, and you can go to a link which will be emailed to you afterwards. The conference this year is on live stream, so we won't at this point suggest that you all go back to your desks and you can watch it from there. Hence Ian and I are looking rather smart today. If you'd like to tweet, please discreetly tweet. So there's nothing worse than everybody sitting in the front row not listening to what's going on actually on the stage. But our hashtag is #ScotRes14, and we'd love to hear your comments and hear how you feel the day and tomorrow is going. Refreshments and lunch, we'll be back through where we were this morning. Lots of stands and people to talk to, and people have spent their time setting up and offering their services, so please go and talk to them. But we'll keep reminding you throughout the day. And our conference sponsors. This conference is organised by the CIWM and Zero Waste Scotland, but we need the help of the sponsors every year to make this a successful day. So very much, huge thanks to Viridor, British Heart Foundation, ACE UK, and AluPro for sponsoring the local authority bursary package. So some of you will be here on behalf of that today. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Ian to get on with the show. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Linda. I got my hair specially done for today for the live streaming. Hope you all noticed. Anyway, good morning, everyone. Absolutely delighted to be here again and to welcome everyone to this 13th Scottish Resources Conference. The fact that it's 13th and we've got over 350 people booked to attend over the 2 days, and another 300, 400 people at the dinner on Wednesday night shows that this is still the must-attend event for this agenda in Scotland. So welcome, everyone. As ever, I hope there's something for everybody on the agenda, but more importantly is about what you want to get out of it in terms of the opportunity to network and share your experiences and knowledge and talk to other people. So hopefully, again, we've got a good balance of opportunities to come in to the sort of informal presentations and workshops and side sessions, but more importantly, there's enough time for everybody to get to know each other, new faces and old. So yeah, hopefully everybody we'll have a great time as we're obviously part of the organising committee, very much looking forward to it. We think we've got a really good agenda this year, and hopefully everybody else will think the same. I guess it just occurs to me at this point just to kind of reflect on what we've all done, I guess, here in Scotland over the last year. When we were all standing here last year, certainly I was standing here last year, talking about a few things that were about to happen. Significantly, I think last year the conversation was on the forthcoming waste regulations, which came into force in January of this year. I think there was one of the sessions was debating on what the impact would be of those regulations. The fact that they've come in and, as far as we know, and if you can see happening on the ground, there's been considerable change out there, particularly within the business, commercial collection infrastructure. It's a real credit that those were rolled out on the 1st of January, a really tough date to roll anything out. I'm sure everybody will agree, but the fact that they're there and we've really have changed, as part of that zero waste journey, really changed another huge tranche of the public and businesses, their attitudes to waste going forward. And I think that's credit to everybody who was involved in that, particularly obviously SEPA in terms of their role in terms of regulations, but also the industry, the waste industry, who really got behind the regulations in the run-up to that into the run-up to the introduction of them in terms of talking to their customers and getting them engaged in the process, and also rolling out the new services, to making sure everybody was regulatory compliant. Certainly from Zero Waste Scotland, we can see the benefits of it, because it's made our life a lot easier, because actually lots of businesses now want to work with us because they realise that there's something they need to be doing. So it's opened doors for us to have that conversation, not just about what they need to do at the back door in terms of recycling, but what they could do at the front door in terms of materials and more resource efficient practices. So I think they can really start, we'll begin to see a real change going through all businesses across Scotland going forward. We've also had, more recently, we've had the carrier bag, 5p carrier bag charge introduced just last week. Hopefully everybody is aware of that. We're doing our bit this morning by giving everybody a nice jute bag at reception when you've come in. You can see a few there, so please look after them, reuse them, take them shopping with you. And again, you know, that's another piece of the zero waste jigsaw in terms of changing people or getting people to think differently about the throwaway culture. The carrier bag legislation was part of a new litter strategy that was launched by Scottish Government in the past year, earlier this summer. Another first ever litter strategy for Scotland since devolution. We've also had two major multi-day events, global events, Commonwealth Games and the Ryder Cup. I'm sure everybody's got their memories of that. I'm sure there's a lot of people in this room who attended it, but there's also a number of partners who were involved in helping those to become the most, setting a new benchmark for sustainability, both in terms of the Commonwealth Games and the Ryder Cup. And there's a kind of legacy there in terms of how events not just will be taken forward here in Scotland in terms of sustainability, but globally as well. I think we should all, everybody that's been involved in those events, be particularly proud of that. Scottish Government and COSLA have also launched a task force in the last year to particularly look at how we can start to align the resources that are coming out now of the public sector, not just the local authorities, but across the wider public sector, around the sort of emerging theme of the circular economy in terms of investing in resource infrastructure here in Scotland. How can we start really making that, maximise those opportunities? So that task force was launched earlier this year, and I think you'll probably hear a lot more about that tomorrow when the Cabinet Secretary comes to address conference. From our point of view, Zero Waste Scotland has been a year of change as well. We became an independent organisation, gained our independence from WRAP, Waste and Resources Action Programme. So that was a bit of a change for us back at the office. We obviously appointed a new board, a new chairperson, Vic Emery, who will be attending the conference tomorrow and speaking to you all. I've also appointed some new board members in the last few months. So this is an exciting time for us at Zero Waste Scotland, and as I said, Vic will be here, and some of the board members will be at the conference as well, so hopefully you'll get an opportunity to meet them. But it really sets, for us, puts us in an even stronger position as an organisation to be obviously much more closer and accountable to funders here in Scotland and key stakeholders, and hopefully much more responsive as we need to be in terms of the agenda here in Scotland. In terms of independence, we obviously had a referendum in September. I'm not going to say too much about that. Again, I'll leave that to the Cabinet Secretary to talk about that tomorrow in terms of reflections on that and what that might mean going forward in terms of our agenda. But it was a bit of a tough one in terms of the conference, actually. The advisory group that kind of got together to put the themes and the presentations and the speakers for the conference. Obviously this was done before the referendum, so there was a bit of a kind of, if it's yes, if it's what sort of discussions do you think we'll have to have, if it's no, what sort of discussions. So it was quite a challenge actually to putting together the conference. So again, I hope we've got the balance right. Again, it's clear that there is going to be change in Scotland, both potentially politically and in terms of the constitutional new powers, etc. So that's all yet to be seen. But there is change ahead, and more fundamentally in terms of our agenda, the circular economy and the sort of ideas that we have around new businesses here in Scotland making more use of the materials that are coming out. There is going to be fundamental change. So I guess the idea of the conference is to look at that big picture, is to start thinking, yeah, okay, we've got some nitty-gritty stuff that we need to discuss, but let's start thinking about the bigger picture. on where we should be going to ensure we do secure a more sustainable economy here in Scotland for the long term, not just for the here and now. So the first presentation that we're going to hear from is from Francis Cairncross. Is very much about that. It's really about setting that scene, setting the sort of big picture scene. Francis is an internationally renowned economist and writer. She's written exclusively on business and industrial change. So what drives innovation and evolution in the economy? So what are the sort of mega trends in the economy and how they are shaping our destinies, and how can we all respond to those types of things going forward? She's written a number of books. Her books include Costing the Earth, The Challenge for Governments, The Opportunities for Business, and The Death of Distance, How Communications Revolution is Changing Our Lives. She's been an economic advisor to the Scottish Government. She's about to relocate her professional life to Scotland, leaving her post as rector of Exeter College at Oxford University, as she's about to take up a role as the chair of court at Heriot-Watt University. So I'm sure you'll all join me in giving her a very warm welcome. I'd like to introduce Francis Cairncross. Thank you.
Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you for that very warm welcome. I am, as Ian said, going to talk about the big picture, and here are the three topics that I want to say something about, so that you've got some feel for the structure of my talk. Global trends, Scotland's economy, and perhaps a few ideas for Scotland's economists, so Scotland's environmentalists. But I want to do it in this context. Donald Rumsfeld, who you remember was worked for George Bush, came up with this really rather wonderful categorization of the problems that everybody faces, whether they are politicians, chief executives, people in business, the known knowns, the known unknowns, and the things that we don't know that we don't know. And it's easy to think of the plenty of unknown unknowns. Last week on an aeroplane, I watched Stanley Kubrick's 1968 film on 2001 Space Odyssey. And it, as you'll remember, had a vicious computer and a voyage to Jupiter that went wrong, but the leading actors didn't have mobile phones or any telecommunications, mobile telecommunications equipment. So that is what would have been in 68 an unknown unknown. Another example, who would have thought in the 1990s that religion was going to be one of the main causes of global unrest and global terrorism? It would have been very improbable indeed. So let's start with three global trends: economic, technology, and demography. And the huge economic change that has taken place in the lifetime of everyone in this room has been the rise of the emerging nations, the emerging economies, and particularly of the real giant ones, the so-called BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, and China. This is largely a tale about China, which until about 150 years ago was the world's biggest economy, because population size, until the Industrial Revolution really got going, drove economic size, and now, once again, is the world's biggest economy. That single change is part of the whole pattern of the extraordinary growth that we have seen in the economies of the emerging nations. If you look back to 1990, the developing countries, as we called them then, accounted for less than a third of the world economy, and the world economy was much smaller then, so it was a smaller share of a smaller economy. Today, last year, was the first year when the emerging economies accounted for more than half of a much, much larger world economy. So this is a change which has been extraordinary. The BRICS now account for 4 of the world's 10 largest economies. And it's a change that will not come again. Not in our lifetime, not in our grandchildren's lifetime, probably not ever again. And the reason I can say that with confidence is because this has been about an extraordinary closing of a gap. Most curves tend to follow that pattern, and that's the pattern that this will follow. The rate of growth will slow down. The next 11 big economies, or the next 5, which I think people call the mints, I can't remember which countries that stands for, but Mexico is the first, are all much smaller, even Nigeria, smaller in population terms, and that's the starting point for economic growth. So we're not going to see again something like this happen. And one of the most dramatic consequences of what we've seen has been the removal from poverty of, or the great reduction in the poverty of the people who live in most of the world's very poor countries. This has taken more than 1 billion people out of poverty. And when everybody bangs on about growing inequality in the world today, and there is global inequality within nations, there is also a much greater degree of equality between nations. And there is a great deal less poverty today in the world than there was in 1990. So that is an incredible and wonderful change. Second area of huge change has been technology. I'm not going to say anything about biotechnology, but if you look at the digital revolution, again, in our lifetimes, it has been absolutely extraordinary. And it has been something, it's hard to realize how recent a lot of the companies that dominate our lives are. Google, 16 years old, I think. Twitter, less than a decade old. Look at the way it's changed politics all around the world, not just in Britain, but in Tunisia with the Arab Spring, in China, making it much harder for the government to reject the views of people because Twitter tells the nation what people are thinking. So there are very profound impacts that these very recent technologies happen. Is there anyone in this room who doesn't have possess a mobile phone? You stick your hand up if you don't. Now, you see, 10 years ago, there would have been 1 or 2, 20 years ago, almost all of you would have stuck up a hand. This is very, very new, and it's changed all sorts of personal habits. It's changed the way companies operate. It's changed the way governments operate. And we are still at the beginning of those changes. One of the important things about changes in technology is that you often don't quite know where they're going to lead you to. It would have been unimaginable 20 years ago that Africa, for example, would have had mobile banking, allowing people to use their mobile phones as a banking tool, something that we're not quite up to doing in the West yet. But it's also going to change, and is changing, in many ways, what happens in environmental management. Just a few examples on the screen. We can measure more things. We have a much clearer idea of how efficient our car engines are. We have a much clearer idea of what the best route to take somewhere is. It's extraordinary, if you think about it, that for free, paying nothing more than your standard phone charge, your smartphone can tell you which road to take, where the traffic jams are least, and do it in real time, because it measures who else is using their phone in the area, and from that it knows whether there's a big jam or whether there's light traffic on the road. And that's a free resource. It doesn't show up in the GDP figures. It's an improvement in the quality of our lives to know that you shouldn't take this road, you should take that road, and know it immediately, not to have to phone up someone before you leave. and all that is effectively free. We know far more about the energy we're using. And I think one important area is that battery technology is steadily improving. And that matters not just for communications, but it also matters for the storage of variable sources of power, like wind power. There will be ways in which these two technologies help each other. Here is the third huge change in demography. There are actually two changes going on, but I thought the most striking was that in the enormous rise in the proportion of centenarians, the numbers of centenarians in this country, of children who are now 10 years old. I can't remember what the number is for boys, but for girls, on present trends, 1 in 3 of them will see their 100th birthday. Poor old Queen, in 1952, she sent 250 or so letters of congratulation to centenarians. Now she has to send 1,000. And if she's still around when all those kids live to be 100, she probably will do nothing else but sign telegrams of congratulation. Hallmark now sells globally something like 85,000 congratulatory 100th birthday cards. And there will, by 2069, China will have 1 million people aged 100 or over. And one of the questions here, one of the important questions is how, not just how are these people going to, and many of you in the room will probably be among them, how will you afford to have adequate care when you reach the age of 100 or when you reach the age of 90? How healthy will you be? Will you be able to go on working? Because you can bet your bottom dollar that your pension isn't going to keep you going all that way if you retire at 65 and live to be 100. So people will go on working for longer, and most people in this room will go on working, I suspect, until they're well into their 60s and probably into their 70s too. Don't feel too bad about it. It will probably keep you in good health. But there is a second demographic trend which is as important as this, and that has been the extraordinary move towards countries reaching a steady state or below a steady state in terms of fertility rates. So half the world's population live in countries where the average woman has fewer than 2 children. There will be women who have 3 children or 4 children or 5 children, but there will be far more women who have none or 1 child or just 2. And that is happening in countries of every kind of religious belief, social belief. It's happening in China, it's happening in Turkey, it's happening in Brazil, it's happening all over Europe, it's happening in the United States, and it's starting to happen in India. The only places in the world where it's not happening are in Africa, and particularly sub-Saharan Africa. But it is, of course, important because it affects the size of workforces. And if the population effectively stops growing, but you have more elderly people, then somebody has to help to pay the pensions of those elderly people, and there are fewer and fewer workers relative to the number of older people. And that is going to be one of the big issues that the world is going to have to deal with over the next century. As for the young, they are different from what they used to be. They are showing signs of being more conservative in a whole variety, with a small c, in a whole range of ways. They are much less likely to have a conviction than would have been the case. In 2007, quite recently, about 111,000 kids aged 10 to 17 got a police caution. In last year, it was about a quarter as many. It was 28,000 got a police caution. extraordinary drop in misbehaviour, and I'm sure that's not because the police were doing less. I think it's because the young were getting up to less mischief. Drug use among the young is falling, cigarette smoking among the young is falling, alcohol consumption among the young, contrary to what you read in the pages of the Daily Mail, is falling. So in all sorts of ways, the young are more conservative. It may be that they're spending all their time indoors playing with their computers. No matter, they're actually behaving better than your generations did, or indeed mine. And they also are more conservative, as you can see from the chart on the right. They're also more conservative in terms of their views on the economy. Everybody else says that growth is what matters. The young say that deficit reduction is what matters. Why do they say that? Because they know jolly well who is going to end up paying for the deficit in the future. The main problem for the young is that they haven't yet learned to vote. And I don't entirely blame Russell Brand for that, but he certainly isn't helping. If you look at the last election, 3/4 of people aged 64 and over went to the polls, compared with less than half, 44% of 18 to 24-year-olds. So for the young, getting out there and voting is really important. And perhaps somebody could try to persuade Russell Brand that if people really want to seize their political future, the first thing they've got to do is go to the ballot box. Now let me move on to my second big theme, which is the challenges to Scotland's economy. And you'll see that I'm going to talk a little bit about the referendum, a little bit about public debt, and about entrepreneurialism. The aftermath of the referendum. I think we're in unknown territory here, or at least that's how it looks south of the border. What one sees south of the border is that 1 million Scots voted to quit the Union, and they were defeated mainly by those voting pensioners who were, as far as one could tell, the only age cohort in which a majority, a substantial majority, voted to remain in the Union. Now, if you are thinking of locating a business in Scotland, that doesn't necessarily seem very encouraging at the moment. It might turn out in the long run to be wonderful, but if you're thinking of locating a business, you're probably thinking about the next 10 years. And as you can see from this Alex Salmond quote, it's very hard for people south of the border, or indeed in other countries, to be absolutely sure that the referendum issues are not going to return. And the danger for Scotland, I think, is that it suffers from what has happened to Quebec, which 3 times narrowly voted not to leave its union with Canada, and which subsequently has clearly suffered slower economic growth than the other provinces of Scotland. So the aftermath of the referendum is going to be negative for the Scottish economy. How negative, one doesn't know, but it's not, on balance, a plus. Add to that what's happening to the public sector deficit. In spite of everything that you read about, rising taxes and falling public spending, the public sector net debt, which is what's in this chart, has continued to rise inexorably. It's rising at a slower rate, but it is not much slower, and it is indeed continuing to rise. And it's rising partly because debt interest is rising. The bigger the debt, the more interest government has to pay, even at these low interest rates. And it's also rising because social benefits have continued to rise in cost. Why, when we hear so much about the cuts in benefits? Well, because the number of pensioners has increased, and they all go to the polls. And so does government do anything to touch pensioner perks such as the senior rail card, on which I travelled first class from London to Edinburgh the other night. No, it doesn't. Is that just? Of course it's not. But we go out and vote, and the young don't, and that's one of the consequences. Now, in the first half of 2014, we found that tax receipts are down on the same period in 2013, and that's really very worrying because this situation can't continue. And the next time there is a downturn in the economy, and that will come pretty soon because the economic cycle has not disappeared, whatever we hope. There will be another downturn, and it will happen before the end of this decade. And when that happens, the public sector deficit will go up again. And there is not a cure for it in raising taxes. One of the consequences of the fact that people have lower overall real incomes and that new jobs tend to be lower paid jobs than used to be the case, and the gap between rich and poor has increased, is that the rich are carrying a larger share of the tax burden. And you may say, quite right too, but I bet there are one or two people in this room who are jolly close to being in that top 1%, which is paying, these are household incomes, which are paying 30% of all income tax. Having 1% of your taxpayers accounting for 30% of your most important tax is not a very solid basis on which to operate, because as they are the wealthiest, they will all have accountants, and the accountants will all tell them that there are ways in which they could be paying a bit less tax, and no doubt some of them are taking advantage of that. So somewhere down the track, we're going to have to think very hard about just what government should do and should pay for, and what individuals should pay for and perhaps do without. And that's going to be a very painful debate, but we are going to have it, and we're going to have to start having it in earnest before the end of this decade. Why does it particularly matter to Scotland? Well, here is the Institute for Fiscal Studies, probably the best and most unbiased independent economic think tank in the country. I happen to chair its executive committee, so I say that in a completely unbiased way, saying that total public spending for the benefit of Scotland in 2012-13 was 11.5% higher than per capita spending across the UK as a whole. And what it's basically saying is that Scotland does benefit from public spending more than the UK as a whole. And then it's secondly saying, another point, the health of Scotland's public finances is strongly linked to the scale of revenues from oil and gas production. And as you know, the oil price has dropped 20% since June, and there at least one big North Sea project is on hold. So as a country where public spending matters, the threats to the scale of public spending at the moment are particular threats to Scotland. And while the whole UK will be hurt when we really have to tackle the deficit, Scotland will be one of the regions that is hurt particularly. The third point that I'm making under this heading of Scotland's economy is the absence of entrepreneurialism in Scotland. What that map shows you is that Scotland has the second lowest number of small private sector businesses relative to its population, or the second smallest in the United Kingdom. And this is important because small businesses are the big job creators in the economy. They go bust, of course, but on balance, they create more jobs than big businesses do. A study that Nottingham University did a little while ago found that they accounted for something like 2/3 of new jobs in the average year. It may not matter in one sense, in that the number of jobs in the economy has been growing very, very fast. It's showing some signs now of slowing down, But as you can see from that chart, it shot up the number of new jobs in the last 3 years, and particularly it shot up in the last 18 months or so. It's rising. This doesn't mean that real wages have been rising. So a lot of these are jobs which are low paid, and a lot of them, as I'll show you in a minute, are jobs of people who are self-employed. And it's also precarious. The United States economy is growing, Britain is growing, but over there in Europe, there is a new slump building up, and what's happening in Europe to the European economies, particularly, to all the big economies in Europe, is very frightening at the moment, in my view. A lot of the new jobs, as I said, are in self-employment, and that has been rising extraordinarily steeply, where actually, I think they probably account for more like half of all new jobs since 2008, rather than most, but they certainly account for a high proportion. And one of the most interesting trends, I think, is that we are moving towards a point where there will be more people self-employed in this country than people working in the public sector. And an interesting mind exercise to think about on your way home tonight is, how will this country be different when public servants are scarcer than people working for themselves? What does that do to all kinds of regulation, to the provision of services, to taxation, to a whole lot of areas of British life? So this trend has been a very important one. It looks as though it's gone hand in hand with the fall in incomes, and indeed helps to account for the fall in incomes. But as you will all know, self-employment gives different opportunities for paying tax, if I can put it that way, from being in a PAYE job, and that may be part of the story that's happening there, because it's certainly the way in which people behave suggests that they are not feeling a lot poorer. They're paying down household debt, credit card debt, and mortgage debt, and retail sales. They're buying a lot of furniture, and they're buying a lot of new cars. If you look by where people spend their money, it's not quite as obvious that everybody is feeling very poor as it is if you just look at the figures for wages. And finally, under this heading, here's self-employment in Scotland. And as you can see, it is the second lowest concentration in the United Kingdom. So if this is the way of the future, if this is where the main jobs growth is going to come from in the future, Scotland is behind the pack, and it may be that this goes hand in hand with Scotland's lower level of small business startups is part of the reason for that. And I don't quite know the answer to this. I'd love to hear some ideas from you as to why Scotland is not good at creating small businesses. But it's certainly a factor in the health of the Scottish economy going forward. Now, finally and quickly, I just want to toss out three challenging ideas for Scotland's environmentalists. Climate change. We don't know very much, and there hasn't been very much research yet on the differential impacts of climate change in different regions of the world. But I think it's pretty obvious that growing warmer has different implications for different countries. And it also looks as though countries towards the equator will see larger rises in average temperature than countries further away from the equator. If it became clear over the next 20 years that actually Scotland wasn't going to do too badly from global warming, there might be some benefits as well as some costs, how would that affect Scottish attitudes to in the plea, and I think the very reasonable plea of environmentalists, that we shouldn't be conducting this extraordinary experiment with the global climate? Would Scots feel the same about it as, say, people living on the equator? I wonder. Secondly, what about nuclear power? Scotland has been and continues to be a nuclear country, not quite in the sense that the French are a nuclear country, but it's still a big chunk of Scottish electricity generation. Are we quite sure that the rush for renewables is the best path to take for the benefit of the environment, or indeed for the benefit of the economy? This is partly an argument about the environment, and here is James Hansen, who's a very distinguished American economist, environmentalist, saying that nuclear energy, or in spite of its challenges, really needs to be retained and significantly expanded in order to avoid the consequences of unabated climate change and air pollution that fossil fuel burning causes. Now, China is certainly taking James Hansen at his word and plans to build a huge number of nuclear plants, probably more than any other country put together in the next few years. And as it does that, China will develop technologies in the nuclear field that will be exported to a great many developing countries that don't have their own sources of fossil fuels. The big problem at the moment is cost. Nuclear power the capital cost of nuclear power is very high. But that won't necessarily continue if China learns how to, by making a lot of plants, how to make cheaper plants. There's some talk, incidentally, about putting plants out at sea on floating platforms as a safer technology. What if China masters that? Might Scotland be interested in that? We might at least think about it. Final challenge, what if Scots would really rather not spend the money on getting greener? Some environmental policies you get 2 for 1. They are both cut your costs, cut your government spending, and they deliver a cleaner environment. If you think of subsidies to the coal industry in many countries or to big agriculture, those are great examples. Get rid of those subsidies. People will have to pay less taxes in order to finance them, and the environment will benefit. And those sorts of environmental policies are totally win-win, fine. But others cost real money, and the payoff may be a long way into the future, and that may make them a hard political sell, because there are a great many voters who rather agree with Groucho Marx, who famously said, "Why should I care about posterity? What's posterity ever done for me?" So that is my third environmental problem, and it's something which I think environmentalists everywhere need to think about. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you very much, Francis. Thank you very much indeed. Great commentary of global trends at the moment and how they might impact on Scotland. So we have some time for questions. We started a bit late, so I'm going to take this opportunity just maybe to run on if everybody has lots of questions to ask. So I'm trying to look out the lights here. Usual drill, if you want to put your hand up, there's roving mics, and if you want to say who you are and where you come from, that will help Francis. Any questions for Francis? Had to be furthest away, Mark.
Yes, hello. Alistair Newenhouse from Oilmac. We're involved in the oil industry and in reuse of redundant equipment offshore platforms. But I was just wondering if you factored into the discussion on the Scottish economy, particularly with reference to the potential independence, the cost of decommissioning in the North Sea, which is anticipated to be something in the order of 40 billion over the next 20 years and rising, and what impact that will have, because it looks like the taxpayer is going to pay more than 60% of the cost of this decommissioning.
Well, if your question is basically before voting for independence, should the yes vote have worried about paying for decommissioning North Sea oil, my reply would be, of course. But I don't think that yes voters were voting primarily because they had read the small print in economics, or if they had done it, there were other things that mattered more. I feel uncomfortable talking about the referendum because it was, of course, a matter for people north of the border, not south of it, even those of us who had spent a lot of our lives in Scotland. But I think this was about the heart versus the head. And sometimes the heart is more important for nations when they are considering their future.
George.
Hi, George Burgess from the Scottish Government. You might not want to talk about that referendum, but can I tempt you to talk about another one? You referred there to the potential post-referendum economic effects as seen in Canada. With the possibility of another referendum about Europe in the next couple of years, might we see similar effects there?
I think it's perfectly possible that that we will see similar effects with the European referendum. I think the trouble with something like a referendum, with a public debate about whether you should or shouldn't retain the current political arrangements, is that they produce uncertainty. And when investors see, if the European referendum produces a very large vote one way or the other, then it will, to some extent, end the question and remove the uncertainty. But I think the chances are that the European referendum will, like the Scottish referendum, leave us with a situation where it's clear that 40% of Brits want to leave Europe and 60% kind of resigned to staying. That's my guess. And that's hardly a heartwarming endorsement of the present arrangements. So I think that if people don't believe, the key thing is, if people don't believe that the referendum really settles the matter, if they think that change is still likely, that's the big question. Will the Scots continue to move, have another bite at the question? It seems to me rather likely in 10 years' time that there might well be another independence referendum. Will the Brits, if they turn down leaving the EU, come back to the question? That seems to me, again, something that's possible. Once you start asking the general public the question, the general public begins to think that it really has a say in the matter, and it wants to be consulted from time to time about whether it hasn't changed its mind. So that is unsettling for companies. And the one thing that investors dislike most of all, or the big investors, conventional investors dislike most of all, is uncertainty. Uncertainty is, of course, where you ultimately make the money. But if you're a big company, that's not what you go for.
Okay. Anybody else? Hold the back. John?
Thank you, Francis. John Fargus, Nico ID. A common thread throughout your presentation is the increasing complexity of the world we live in, driven by increasing population, the shrinking world, rapid technological change, corporatization, the complexity of global fiscal and legal structures to manage globalization, which has driven many good things. But that complexity has its own problems. Do you think part of the response to this is that we have to try and decentralize, localize, decorporatize, and actually come up with more resilient local economies where we have the essentials of energy and water and food pretty much secure, whilst we recognize that we also play a part in the globalizing world and that there is the benefits of the complexity, but we have to simplify certain things?
Well, localizing always sounds wonderful. But if what you're talking about is should you move more political decisions down to are you not talking about that?
I'm talking more about people being empowered.
People being empowered.
We had a revolution in renewable energy.
Well, if you're talking about people...
communities as much as they could have, for example.
the kinds of energy that people can benefit from that don't require government or big corporate activity are rather few. You can chop down trees and burn them, or collect turf and burn it, or you can probably put up a small windmill in your garden. But if you want electricity, or you want oil, or you want gas, or you want coal, you are inevitably dependent on others. So localization is never going to be really a possibility, I think. I mean, I think there may be ways in which big companies can encourage local areas to change their use of energy behavior. But, these are not things where the way in which the energy market works actually defies localism more than almost any other market. You can grow your own food, but you can't easily grow your own coal or gas. So that is a real problem with localization. And as for regulation, local regulation, I think one of the big questions there is, who do you trust most? Do you trust local politicians, or do you trust the politicians in Edinburgh, or do you trust the politicians in London? And you probably don't trust any of them. But personally, as far as this country goes, I would trust Edinburgh before I would trust the local politicians in the region I know best, which I will not reveal for fear of never being allowed to go home again. So, localization sounds wonderful, but it has limited usefulness. I think deregulation is another matter. I think deregulation is something that's extremely desirable. But with deregulation often must go an increased popular willingness to accept risk. There is a ghastly thing called the doctrine of vicarious liability in English law, and I suspect in Scottish law, which basically says, when I was head of Exeter College, if one of the waiting staff spilled scalding soup into the lap, because he tripped and spilled scalding soup into the lap of the distinguished guest sitting next to me, the college could be sued for a large amount of money. If you're not willing, if people are not willing to take risks that they will be scalded or drowned or burnt or whatever, then you have to have regulation which makes everyone's lives inconvenient.
Yeah.
I think you might need the mic. Where's the mic?
I know. Sorry,
run back. Go on, rove. Hang on, you go towards him, because that way we'll get there quicker. Okay. I can't hear you well enough.
It's an interesting discussion, and it's more maybe about decentralization. I mean, I like the idea of localism for some things, but decentralization, when we have government policy, for example, saying if we used all of the heat from our energy generation systems, we're wasting more heat than we use and use energy sources for. So decentralization, intelligent strategic planning, putting facilities in the right places so we get the best value from these things. I find it a rather depressing...
What you're talking about is actually the electricity regulator making sure that the system works as efficiently as possible. And that's, to a large extent, a question of pricing, and partly a question of what investments you've put in. It's not really a question of decentralization or localization. It's a question of making sure that you use the whole network as efficiently as possible.
Yeah, not when it comes to heat, but that's a very interesting discussion. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks. Great points.
Anything else? Oh. I'm trying to scan the whole audience. Difficult in the light.
It's easier to see from here.
It is,
but they can't hear you.
You've got a microphone.
I've got a microphone. Yes. You can shout into my microphone.
Francis, when you were talking about the global trends and the exponential heat, I suppose, of the whole globe, and you showed a very nice picture of Nairn Beach, and you made a comment about whether or not Scots would choose to be richer or greener. And I was curious, in terms of your obvious expertise, what policies or regulations you might consider putting in place to help us to choose greener as opposed to just richer?
I would start with policies that made clear economic sense. I would start with things like removing any agricultural subsidy that involved encouraging people, to plant crops that weren't needed in an area. I would I would actually do some serious road building so that people wasted less energy sitting in traffic jams. I would do things that saved energy in ways that made good economic sense. I would take politics out of the energy market and put more economics into it. Now that would mean probably no more offshore wind farms, for example. I think offshore wind farms are the sort of thing that make people angry about environmental measures rather than in favour of them, because people know that they produce incredibly expensive energy and that they are not economically rational ways of doing anything about the environment. Ultimately, conservation is going to be extremely important, and new technologies are going to be extremely important. And having tax structures that get, encouraging things like solar power. I think solar power is a good bet. I'm not sure this is the best country to develop solar power in, but it is a good bet. Seem to me to be much better than picking technologies that are always going to be at the outer end of the price band and getting the taxpayer or the electricity user to finance them.
Okay. Any more? We are now in... Sorry, yeah, sorry.
Am I?
Sorry, yeah, of course. I thought you were telling me to wind up.
No, I've got a question as well. Just with the Scottish Government kind of push on creating the environment for business and the waste industry being part of that is seen as a potential job creator, and especially on an SME type scale. Given that we can't get the 18 to 24-year-olds off their backsides, how do we close that gap of being the least entrepreneurial nearly of the UK and getting those guys involved?
How to work that? Oh, that's a very difficult question.
Sorry.
That's a very, very difficult question. I think that the good role models help to persuade people that being entrepreneurial is great. Schemes that encourage the young when they leave school to think about setting something up on their own are a good thing. I think one of the problems at the moment for entrepreneurialism in Scotland is that the public sector pays people rather well relative to what small businesses can usually afford. So that, as it were, the floor price for the cheap end of the job market, the low-paid end of the job market, which is what a lot of small businesses want to use in the first instance, is quite high. But it's a lot of it's a matter of changing attitudes. I was staying with friends in a part of the Highlands where there was, and they run a stalking business. And they told me how the very good little restaurant just down the road shuts at, I think, 8:30, and how they had guests staying there, and they'd rung up, and the guests had arrived at sort of 8:20, and they had rung the restaurant and said, could you fit them in? And the restaurant had said, oh, well, they'll have to hurry, we're closing in 10 minutes. They didn't say, great, another cover for the evening. And I don't know quite how you change that attitude. I've just come back from the United States where people do undoubtedly, I think a lot of people do pretty terrible jobs, but they do work longer and they do set things up and they do start things, and there is a sort of feeling of a different approach from one that you find in many parts of the United Kingdom. So I think it's a culture change as much as anything else. And if the waste management industry can drive it, that would be fantastic. Maybe, who knows, maybe Harriet Watt can help.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Francis. I think that's an important point, because I'm conscious that Ewan's here from Scottish Enterprise, and I think there's other people from Scottish Enterprise here, because this is a big part of what our agenda is here in Scotland. It is about creating employment opportunities, and here in Scotland, not just in the collection, but in the reprocessing infrastructure. So, yeah, understanding how that all works or doesn't work, and we need to sort of possibly focus a little bit more on it. I.e., it's just not going to happen, without some sort of real thinking on how do we make sure that those jobs are here in Scotland, and it's our young people that are coming through is very important for us as an industry. Anyway, I'll allow you all now to go for coffee and for networking before the next session. It starts at 12 promptly. I guess I'd really just like to thank again our speaker Francis Cairncross for a really very grounded view of the current economy and the trends going forward, and I think it is very important for us when sometimes we're looking right down at what we're doing on the ground to sort of lift our heads and see that bigger picture and try and understand what's going on. So hopefully you found that very useful. So on behalf of you all, I'd like you to thank Francis again for coming. Thank you very much.